The international relations of human rights. Most political systems have an evangelical component where they seek to spread geographically their values in order to assert their domestic legitimacy. To justify communism, democracy, or militant takfirism, adherents have sought to spread their values beyond the state. Democracies have a tendency to assert the values of human rights in their foreign policy. Western states have tended to adopt foreign policies that are a blend of realpolitik, power politics, and liberal values, often associated with human rights. This mix varies in response to pragmatic limitations and the configuration of domestic politics, as well as in response to the pragmatic limitations of policy. For example, during the Cold War, the US put a strong emphasis on the demand for human rights behind the Iron Curtain in the Warsaw Pact countries, the communist countries occupied by the Soviet Union, while putting less of an emphasis on human rights in its relationship with its allies in Central America, such as El Salvador and Guatemala. So, in Eastern and Central Europe, the US was trying to spread resistance to communism, whereas in Latin America, the US was trying to suppress communist insurgents, and it occasionally didn't interfere when the local government forces committed an atrocity. It was widely believed that the 1975 Helsinki Accords on human rights had a significant impact on influencing dissidents within the Soviet Union and ultimately ending the Cold War. This is important because it tells us that human rights led to the internal transformation of the Soviet Union and encouraged those who wanted a different system to resist communism. However, the Cold War also limited state support for United Nations human rights initiatives. The end of the Cold War led to a rapid expansion of human rights legislation in the 1990s. This was reversed by the US reaction to the terror attacks on the World Trade Center in September of 2001. Human rights depends to a large extent on popular opinion and is in fact a good measure of that dimension in politics. A good illustrating case was the Greek revolt that ultimately established Greek independence. Strategically, the English supported the Ottoman Empire as a block to the spread of Russian imperialism through the Bosphorus and into the Mediterranean, and through the Caucasus and into the Middle East. The British wanted to safeguard their commercial interests in the Mediterranean. However, Greek revolts were being publicized by the English poet Byron, and the newspapers in England were also romantically swayed by the idea that Greece was the origin of Western civilization. And so widespread popular support for the independence of Greece came up against the cold power calculation that England needed to preserve the Ottoman Empire, with the result that the popular demand for Greek independence prevailed. The British had to deploy their navy to help the Greeks against the Ottoman. But that support was ultimately limited, and once the Peloponnese and Attica were independent, the British then reversed their policy and contained further Greek moves towards independence. And so this highlights the importance of activism in mobilizing popular opinion. So two major questions about international human rights is what causes them to be institutionalized and what effect do they have on the behavior of states. Human rights generally comes from an externalization of a state's norms onto the international level, often by activists and lawyers, who do so for domestic political reasons, and do so in permissive times of peace. The effects of human rights on state behavior depends to a large extent on the internalization of domestic norms. The different approaches in international relations can explain aspects of the human rights phenomenon. Let's start with realism. For Thomas Hobbes, the author of The Leviathan, Treaties, including human rights treaties, without enforcement mechanisms such as the threat of force are merely paper. Realism explains the double standard paradox. Why states publicly submit to human rights treaties, but leaders often subordinate human rights to other goals of the national interest. 1. The explanation is that there are instances where the requirement to obtain or maintain power, a state will not follow human rights rules. 2. Human rights treaties are followed to the extent that they are enforceable, and international anarchy makes enforcing treaties between major powers difficult. 3. Major powers that have pushed universal moral claims, such as replacing barbarian rule, evangelical Christendom or Islam, Confucian tributary systems, bringing civilization to Africa in the 1880s, often do so for narrow self-interest. For example, the U.S. push for the principle of national self-determination during and after the First World War was in part supported by the U.S. desire to remove imperial colonialism in order to create a world of more trading partners for the U.S. The U.S. push for democracy in the Middle East recently can be seen as an attempt to weaken the bureaucracy of enemy states in order to stop their ability to build nuclear weapons, such as in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Iran. Liberalism is the second approach. Liberalism is based on the social contract theory of John Locke, and the extension of this internationally into the democratic peace as described by Immanuel Kant. Both of these are based on the concept of fundamental individual rights. The political act of defending an individual's legal right, which can have their basis in either natural law or contract law, where contract law is rights that are the result of a constitutional arrangement in a state between themselves and their leader. And also, the belief in the right's universal nature leads the right to be extended to other states in the international system. The accumulation of rights from the Enlightenment of the 17th century was codified in the 19th century and was largely concentrated in the United Nations initiatives in 1945, of which the most important is the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Liberalism explains two phenomena. One, institutionalized international human rights leads to policies to replace authoritarian governments, which are often seen as the greatest resistors to human rights. For example, the end of the Cold War, through a demonstration effect, led to the replacement of a number of authoritarian and communist states with democracies. And it is this that led to the large growth in human rights institutionalization in the 1990s. Number 2, institutionalized international human rights leads to policies that seek stronger international institutions, which is often at odds with state sovereignty. For example, the emergence of human rights in the 1970s was the result of international legalization of domestic human rights norms. The European Union, for example, had created the European Court of Human Rights. With regard to human rights, Constructivism links norms and interests within the context of how states are created by ideas. One norm is that states should focus on human security and not simply traditional national security. So what is human security? Well, there's an emerging norm that renders security a contested concept, rather than solely being about traditional state security. It stretches the term to the application of state instruments to protect the individual citizen's rights as an alternative reference point. Now, what's a contested concept? It's a term whose fundamental meaning is being publicly challenged or appropriated by competing groups. It usually involves a concept that has significant public value, like the term security. For example, containment theory, which was the West's primary strategy for defeating European communism, was based on blocking Soviet military expansion, while waiting and encouraging the development of a Soviet middle class that would create the democratic norms that would lead to the overthrow of communist totalitarianism. Constructivists explain that 1. When rights are a fundamental component of the creation of a state or a superstate identity, the members of that collectivity will have an incentive to spread their universal claims abroad. For example, human rights compliance was a core requirement for membership in the European Union. 2. Human rights ideas spread to become institutionalized norms through norm cascades in a 5-step process. 1. An act of human rights repression in a country. 2. Human rights groups criticize the state responsible for the act of repression. 3. International human rights groups help repressed groups to mobilize, and the repressing state is compelled to grant the mobilized groups some legitimacy. 4. The repressing state is compelled by domestic and international pressure to enact human rights legislation. And 5. State institutions then implement human rights compliance automatically. 3. Human rights norms are spread as ideas by transnational social movements who harass and embarrass non-compliant targets. For example, the emergence of human rights in the 1970s was the result of the emergence of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, such as Amnesty International, that was founded in 1961. Non-governmental organizations perform 3 international activities in human rights propagation. 1. Network of communication of rights violations. Not being state actors, NGOs may often have reputations for credibility. 2. Monitoring of treaty compliance by states. 3. NGOs may identify and seek to humiliate non-compliant states. R2P, the responsibility to protect. The massacres in Rwanda in 1993 and 1994 led to the international community to adopt a more interventionist role with regard to human rights violations. This led to the NATO air campaign against Serbia in 1998-1999 in response to Serbian policy in Kosovo. Legalistic attempts to reconcile state sovereignty with human rights obligations to stop incidents of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, was taken up by the Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. Sovereignty was redefined from being a right to exclude foreign intervention to a responsibility to protect domestic populations, a violation of which could result in the obligation of foreign states to intervene.